Hi, welcome to the IHC Craft Room. I'm Mary. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I dot painted these two cute little terracotta pots. I'll show you all the steps and all the materials. And you don't need any dotting tools for this. I'm going to show you how to do both of these patterns by using things around your house like a pencil and the top of a paintbrush. So grab all your stuff and let's get crafty. This is Mary. Welcome to the IHC Craft Room. For materials, let's begin with the 4-inch terracotta flower pots that I got from the Dollar Tree. Acrylic paint in white, black, tropical blue, Christmas red, Christmas green, tutti frutti, bright yellow, and lavender. Liquitex matte varnish, and Minwax polyacrylic clear gloss protective finish. For tools, we'll begin with parchment paper, a wet rag, a paint palette, a cup of water, some painter's tape, Q-tips, toothpicks, and some paintbrushes, a pencil, a wood skewer, and some other random items from around my home. Let's get started by prepping these terracotta pots so that they're ready to be dotted. First, I'm going to have an incredibly frustrating battle with these freaking stickers. I should have just used my heat gun, but I was being lazy and paid for it in rage instead. So be smarter than me, okay? Next, I'm going to wipe these pots down really well to get rid of any dust or debris that might have got on them in the store or here at home. Once the pots have dried thoroughly, we're going to hit them with a couple of thin layers of Liquitex matte varnish all over the entire pot, except for the inside and bottom. This step is super important, so let's take a minute to talk about the two different sealers I'm going to be using for this project, and why they're so different and so important. First up is Liquitex matte varnish. This goes on before I start dot painting and only on the outside of the pot, not the inside or bottom. Terracotta is super porous, and this matte varnish helps seal that raw clay. It stops my paint from soaking in and gives me a nice even surface to work on, but it's not tough enough to protect the finished design. It's prep, not armor. That's where Minwax polyacrylic clear gloss comes in. After I finish painting and let it dry for a full 24 to 48 hours, I'm going to seal only the painted areas, not the whole pot. This stuff gives a strong glossy top coat that protects the dots from chips, scratches, and everyday wear. I never seal the inside or bottom of the pot because terracotta needs to breathe. Sealing those areas can trap moisture and cause root rot or cracking. The matte varnish seals the clay, the gloss sealer protects the paint, and together you've got a pot that actually will last and look great doing it. So that's why we're using two sealers. Now that the matte varnish is dry, let's get started with our first design. I'm using a roll of painter's tape to rest the flower pot on. It's super helpful for keeping round objects steady so that you can work on them, but I did eventually stop using it and just held the pot because I make life complicated. Why not? I like to call this the explosion of dots technique, and I used it most recently on some cute little heart magnets. You can check that video out right here. For the explosion of dots technique, we're going to pick a tool and a color and just start dropping dots all around the lip of this pot. I'm starting with the largest dots, so I'm using one of my favorite non-traditional dotting tools, the top of a number 2 pencil. Let's pick a color, dip the eraser side in, and just start dotting. Go ahead and spread them out, bunch them together. Do what feels good to you. Just don't overdo it because we're going to be doing several rounds of dots. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Pick a tool, pick a color, and drop a dot. Easy breezy. I love cheesy, but I'm going to be taking my time so I can avoid overlapping dots. But like, who cares if you do overlap a dot? It's still going to look pretty, you know? I'm just trying to avoid that by leaving a bit of room and letting the dots dry and choosing my tool size accordingly. By the time we near the end of this project, we're going to see that wood skewer will be our best friend because it's the most minute. That and toothpicks, super useful to get into little nooks and crannies. Since we aren't using huge amounts of paint for our dots, this is a project you won't really need to wait on. By the time you make your way around the pot once, the first few dots are pretty much dry. So you can just keep dotting away until you're happy with the final result. And then we'll add a little trim right around the top rim of our flower pot. I'm adding 3 small dots of each color, making my way around the paint palette so that I get a nice mix that doesn't repeat. And if you get to the end and need an extra dot or two, I won't tell anybody. I kind of did just now, didn't I though? Okay, whatever. Let's just pretend I didn't and let's move on. Awesome. Now let's leave this alone and let it dry for about 48 hours before we hit it with a little bit of Minwax polyacrylic. But for now, let's move on to our next flower pot. Let's get started with our biggest dot. I'm using the top of my pencil for this and some black paint. Next, let's find a fairly small tool. I'm using the top of this blue paintbrush to make small dots all the way around the first one, stopping at the lip of the pot. For the next row, I want to bump up the size of my dots, but I'm still going to use the same dotting tool. I'll just make sure to add more paint to my tool, which will cause my dots to be a bit bigger. For row number 3, I'm going to bump up the size just a bit more by switching to this yellow paintbrush instead. Now I ended up spacing this pretty poorly, and by the end I had a noticeable gap, and I decided to leave it cause why not? I enjoy some imperfections in my dot art personally, so I'm gonna leave it, and I'll bet you won't even notice it when I'm done. Row number 4 is where we're gonna start our petals, so we need to bump the size up even more and spread the dots out so that we only have 5 dots on this row. For the petals, I'm using one of my favorite techniques, walk the dots. Now let me show you how it works. I load up my dotting tool with paint, then dot in a line. Dot, 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 without reloading. As the paint runs low, the dots naturally get smaller, creating a smooth fade from big to small. Want to know what the trick is? Don't reload your dotting tool. That single dip is what gives you that gorgeous tapered look. Simple, right? But super satisfying when you get the hang of it, trust me. And you will, because we'll be using this technique quite a bit on this pattern. Let's do that again so that we have a second row of walking the dots. Remember to take your time, more like a spring stroll rather than a brisk winter walk. This video, like all of my videos, is sped up. In real time, I'm dotting much slower. So don't rush, take your time, and enjoy the process. It can be really zen, if you let it be. For row number 5, we're going to use the top of that green paintbrush to drop a black dot right between and slightly above our petals from row 4. Now let's switch to white paint, and using a combination of that skinny blue paintbrush and a wood skewer, we'll create our first white petal by walking the dots all the way around that larger black dot. My plan is to make this mandala black and white with top dot pops of red. It's going to be beautiful. Now let's switch back to our black paint so that we can make a final black petal in row 5 before we move on to row 6. For this row, we're going to switch back to the top of the pencil so that we get a larger black dot for our last row of petals. Then we'll switch back to that skinny blue paintbrush and wood skewer combo with white paint to make our first white petal of row 6. Now let's switch back to black paint, and this time we're going to make 2 rows of black petals at the same time, cause why not? I'm busy, you're busy. Let's economize our time, shall we? You may have noticed that I initially chose not to add a petal to the edges of row 6. But after building out 3 petals, it was feeling very unbalanced, so I went ahead and added a petal to each side to level things out. That looks much better. Let's switch back to white paint for one last petal in row 6, and then the base of our mandala is complete. Now let's let this dry a bit, and then we'll come back and do some top dots. Let's start with a white top dot on our very first black center dot using the top of the green paintbrush. Now we'll switch to the top of that smaller yellow paintbrush and add a top dot to row 4, which was our first row of petals. And then we'll do the same thing to row 5. Adding a top dot to each of the large black dots. Excellent. Now let's switch back to the top of the green paintbrush and add a top dot to the center dot of our petals in row 6. And for a final bit of white, let's switch the dotting tool to the wood skewer, and we'll add a small white top dot to all the dots in row 2. Beautiful. Now let's let these top dots dry for a bit, and then we'll switch over to some red paint for our final accents. For the red top dots, we're going to keep them super small, so I'll alternate between the top of the skinny blue paintbrush and the wood skewer for that. We're going to add a red top dot to all of the white top dots we just created. However, for those tiny dots in row 2, we'll alternate one yes and one no. And sadly, for the first time in a long time, I didn't realize I wasn't recording until it was too late. Such a bummer. So let's take a second to focus on where the red top dots should be, shall we? You already know about the center dot and about how we alternated one yes and one no in row number 2. So let's move on to row number 4. Using the wood skewer, we'll add a red top dot on top of the white ones. And we'll do the same thing for row number 5, but in this row, we'll add a tiny red dot to the tip of our white petals. And lastly, for row number 6, we'll add a top dot to each of the white top dots, and then we'll add a tiny red top dot to the tip of each white petal. And with that, this mandala design is complete. Now let's let this dry for a couple of days, and then it'll be time for the final step. It's been a couple of days since I completed these designs, so I'm going to brush on a thin coat of Minwax polyacrylic to the mandala, and I'll use a Q-tip to clean up where I went a bit too far. Oops. I'm going to do the same thing to our dot explosion, and then I'll wait about 4 hours before doing a second coat on each. And at that point, these pretty ladies will be ready for potting. So what do you think? They turned out super cute, right? And to think we made both of these patterns without using traditional dotting tools, just by thinking outside the box and using different items from around our home. I'm really thrilled with the end result, and I'd love to hear what you think about it in the comments below. If you're interested in learning more about dot painting or maybe wreath making or candle making, check out one of these videos. And don't forget to subscribe so that we can continue to get crafty together. Toodaloo!